Okay, so welcome back to part 5, the conceptual toolkit needed to arrive at understanding what truth is and how it works. So here I'm just going to begin with what I've written. Coming to the realization that truth reduces to a unity, what we discussed in part 4, it then follows that investigating it through this lens requires an understanding of the concepts at play. Why they are important will immediately make itself apparent, giving credibility to the case for unity as the correct pursuit and justification for why no one has ever actually disagreed on this point. This is also what we discussed at the end of part 4. So a good example I like to use here that is quite interesting is and I haven't noticed anybody else mention this, but I realized at some point that monotheism and polytheism ironically do not disagree as much as they tend to argue over whether there is one god or many gods. Take it this way. Technically, the polytheists are the ones who are more open-minded and correct because at base, most polytheistic religions will tell you that they have one force or one god out of which all these mini gods, if you will, emerge. So it's both. And this is getting closer to the truth because both is one of the 4 truth variables that we have, what we call the tetralemma: true, false, both true and false, and neither true and false. I do think that it is still incomplete. Polytheism has obviously a greater, more sophisticated lens through which it sees reality. However, it is incomplete because it is not unified. Polytheism it depends on the religion we're talking about, and perhaps it has. And Hinduism, I would imagine, would be the one that has been able to unify this idea of one and two, the mirology that we were discussing in part 4. However, it's just for the purposes of this example, just take a notice at how the polytheists tend to have this one overarching force. I believe in Hinduism, it's Brahman, and then out of Brahman, you have all these other gods that start to derive forward. Now, in monotheism, namely the Judeo-Christian traditions, we have one God, and that is emphasized emphatically. There is only one God. However, very quickly we start to see how this one God has multiple forms, right? In Christianity, we have God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Spirit. So 3 different forms of God. Now, we could say that these forms are gods in themselves. At this point, it's just semantics. Does it really matter? But then you can go further and look at, even in Islam, that one of the main gripes or arguments or complaints that Islam has with Christianity is that it massively departs from the other Judeo-Christian pillars, especially the one in which that we claim that God is one thing and it is above man. So we do anthropomorphize God. God is manifest as a human being named Jesus Christ. Now, the Jews and the Muslims, they hold on to this pillar of the religion. They say that God cannot be a man. However, I do think that Christianity gets closer to the reconciliation between monotheism and polytheism because it does recognize that God is one thing, but it can also manifest as many different things. But that being said, in Judaism and Islam, we still have demons. We have saints, angels, spirits. So what are those if not deities, meaning beings or, yeah, beings is the word, that have a certain level of power or, dimension to them that goes beyond human form. Essentially, you start to realize that the monotheists are just as polytheistic as the polytheists, and that the polytheists, well, they've always said it, yeah, we are monotheistic. We just don't, they don't tend to worship God in its unified form. I believe the reason de facto every single religion, every single person tends to not devolve, I wouldn't say devolve, but tends to worship reality, whether you call it God or whether, the fact that you worship or view or interface with reality and or God through deities or personifications, if you will, is precisely because we are ourselves limited beings. We see things as separate from each other. This is the reality in which we find ourselves. Therefore, it is easier to connect to the greater force through an intermediary. And that is precisely what Hinduism is all about. If you research the religion a little bit more with profundity, you'll quickly realize that these many deities are like different facets of God, that reflect some kind of doorway that you require. in order to be able to connect to God. So if you are a baker, for example, there's a saint for bakers in Christianity. So you tend to pray to that saint to protect you as a baker and to, make sure you have the best quality bread and all that stuff. So that's because we're interfacing with reality through the lens of our own experience as human beings, be it our careers, be it our desires, our relationships to others. So, monotheism, polytheism, they go hand in hand. And at the end of the day, the reason that I bring this up as a concept is to show how the unification of monotheism and polytheism is just another way or an entry point in through which we can start to be led towards the unitary aspect of God. Okay, so slowing down a little bit, we can look at what I've written down here. We have epistemology, logic, mereology, paradox, Kolmogorov complexity. Okay, these are different things that we're going to require to dig even deeper into this idea of unification, right? Reconciliation. I've just given you a good argument as to why we're already in agreement and we de facto behave the same way. Whether you're a polytheist that's worshiping God, you still see reality as an underlying force that gives reality to all, I guess. It gives existence to all, or whether you're a monotheist that creates dimensions of separation. It's the same thing. They go hand in hand. Now, the animists, which basically sees everything as there being different gods and then they can exist on their own, it's still the same thing because animists tend to believe that there's a God in everything. Every object is infused with some kind of energy or God. And I just don't think they go far enough to say, well, is it infused with one God or is there different things that are being infused in? I'm not so sure, but I'm not sure animism is developed enough for there to be a third kind of option. I just wanted to get that out there. I'm still aware of animism as a practice. I still think that it falls within the category of mono and or polytheism. So it's not too important to dive into. More so would be the idea of epistemology, okay? Because whatever idea we arrive at, we're always stuck with this question of how do we know that we know that? How can we justify it? How can we prove it? Now, I do believe that there's a Kierkegaardian leap of faith that is required that allows you to arrive on the other side of the arguments that we're going to be making so that you can look in hindsight and realize, okay, there in fact was no gap. There was no need to leap because there is solid ground here. So the epistemology is, or the epistemological justification for this theory of truth, let's say, makes itself apparent after the fact. And I think that's really the same for everything, for every conceptualization that we use to arrive at God or truth. People say you have to have faith. Yes, you start with it. I mean, eventually it's like a ladder. You don't require the ladder anymore once you've climbed up. So you can discard the faith. You then no longer need to believe, So I think that epistemology is a little bit of a rabbit hole. If we give ourselves a constraint that we have to prove something logically, and reduce it to logic alone, one very small facet of the nature of reality, then yes, you will never epistemologically arrive at some definitive proof because you're shooting yourself in the foot. You're not allowing it to happen. You're saying, let's do something that we can't do because we don't allow it, right? That's what I think epistemology runs into like problem. But if you realize what we're going to discuss, that there is an epistemological justification after the fact, and that's what's beautiful about the nature of truth. Once you make that leap, Kierkegaard was right in my estimation. Okay, moving on to logic. Logic is another thing that we share. It is so intrinsic to reality. It is baked into the ideas, the language, the behaviors that we have. So obviously we will need to look into logic and how it works. It is the rules of the thoughts that we use to arrive at these concepts that we want to elucidate so that we can come to an agreement as to what truth is as a definition. After that, there's mereology, the parts and wholes things. We've covered that enough. But if you want to look into it a little bit further for your own curiosity, I invite you to do that. Paradox. Paradox is going to be the meat of a lot of this for many different reasons. I won't get into it now, but let's just make the brief statement that a paradox is not just an indication of an error in human reasoning. This is the error that we make. Paradoxes just mean that we're making a mistake somehow and that it's false. No, this is very far from the truth. It is part of the truth, but far from the entire truth. Paradox exists within multiple different kinds of states. There are different kinds of paradoxes, and these paradoxes indicate deep truths. They don't indicate an error, they actually indicate truth. And we're going to look into that as well. Kolmogorov complexity is another thing I want to present, precisely because it's one way of looking at what the endeavor of arriving at truth looks like, or I believe what we have to be doing. Kolmogorov complexity is used in programming mostly. It is the idea of encoding the most amount of information possible within the smallest amount of information. So, for example, if I give you a string of A's and B's, but there are thousands of them, let's say 1,000 A's and then 10,000 B's, A, B, A, B, A, B, A, B, until you have 10,000 each. That's a lot of information. One way to compact that or encode it is to just tell you AB times 1,000. Now, you have a very small piece of information that contains a very large amount of information, and that is Kolmogorov complexity. Now, of course, if I tell you God is the truth or truth is unitary, that is the smallest amount of compacted code for the largest amount. But the issue why we're not satisfied is just because you have a Kolmogorov complexity, or you have encoded the most complexity that you possibly can about the nature of reality into something beautiful and simple, you want to be able to unpack that. You want to be able to unpack it in such a way that it is not something that you have to unpack continuously forever until you realize, okay, there really is 1,000 A's and B's. You want to be able to tap into that code, if you will, AB times 1,000, in such a way that you arrive at it intuitively. It's like it can unpack itself and you can see it in its wholeness. So, that being said, one of the Kolmogorov complexities that exists within religion is the phrase, I am that I am. Something so profound in that. And it takes a little bit of information, a little bit of tools, thinking, to be able to unpack it. Now, some people, they hear it and they're able to unpack it right away. It hits them. Right? There are other Kolmogorov complexities that are even more sophisticated. We call them symbols. If I give you, a symbol like this, it tells you it's very universal. It means that everything is okay, or that it's at least a positive, an additive thing. Or if I sing a high note versus a low note, that symbol or that frequency or resonance also tells you everything you need to know. Good or bad, up or down, right? Additive or subtractive. So there are multiple symbols that we've come up through history, such as the cross in Christianity, which is what is a device that is meant to kill or murder a human being, an execution device. And because of an act of a human being to willingly go and execute themselves for the benefit of all, that very idea, it's such a powerful symbol, and it can be unpacked in kind of any way that you are ready to unpack it for, right? So if I tell you this idea, one person listening to me could think, wow, that means compassion. And another person can think about the idea of sacrificing yourself in such a way, and then it means freedom to them. And yet another person can see that it means both. Wow, that within the compassion of sacrificing yourself willingly, you are actually arriving at a level of transcendence, of freedom from fear of suffering, but you're also practicing love, and that love manifests itself as compassion. You're wiping away the sins of billions of people and to come. So one symbol, a very simple thing, can end up encoding so much complexity. So Kolmogorov complexity is really what we're going to be doing here, but on a more neutral, very clean, logical fashion. So that, if we remove bias, we remove religion, we remove any kind of stench or identification with something that is extremely, let's say, narrowed, then there's a higher degree for most people to arrive at this level of clarity that we are all, in fact, valid in how we connect to the nature of truth, and that perhaps there is a way to connect those in some conceptual form. Beautiful. So paradox, I couldn't elucidate too much why it's important, but it'll be very important, so we'll talk enough about that. But Kolmogorov complexity is the main one here, is to show you how we're going to be proceeding forward and what we will be doing. We do want to reduce to a unity. right? Which basically means a symbol that can encode the truth as it exists in its unitary state. Then we have tautology and teleology. Now, these are two things that exist within philosophy that we run up against, and they're very simple to understand, but most or a lot of people will tell you that if your argument for something being true runs into one of and or both of these concepts, that it is false. That's an assumption. And this is the beauty of metaphysics is you remove all assumptions. You have to be able to take any preconceived notions and actually flip it on its head and actually see if perhaps it is a feature and not a failure or an error, right? So I do argue, and actually not just me, there's plenty of religions and worldviews that says, no, the reason that, truth or this argument or God is tautological or teleological is because that's the way it is. And you just have to accept it that way. And I do think there is a way to appeal to those who don't like the idea of tautology and teleology, regardless, but it takes a little bit of work to get there. Either way, tautology, I like to remember it by saying tautology twice, tautology twice. It is basically saying something twice, but using two different ways to get there, or it's a truth that explains itself. So, for example, what's a good example of tautology here? Let me think. God is God because God is God because he is God. You're saying that God is God, basically. You're not saying anything about what God is or who God is. Whereas a teleology is kind of similar. Teleology is kind of similar in the sense that it is circular. So you are referring back to the same thing. For example, legs exist so that we can walk. So you're explaining what a leg is or what legs are by what they do, but it's not really explaining what the legs are. It's just explaining its function. So we already know that legs are for walking, but what are they really? And that's not really the best example to use, but it should give you a little bit of intuition into being able to grasp a teleology. So the study of the end or the purpose of a thing, or using the purpose of a thing as an explanation for what it is. Now, a lot of people would say that is an error. It is teleological, right? You're saying that something is what it is because of what it does, but that's not really a true definition. So, tautology, teleology, when it comes to very abstract things, especially the main abstract thing on the world stage here of metaphysics, of there being truth, it does fall into tautology and a teleology, and that there's actually a relationship between tautology and teleology. So we will arrive at that at some point. Either way, look into tautology and teleology, try to get a good grasp of that so that when it comes to the time where we're going to be discussing what exactly is tautological and teleological about the nature of reality, it'll click in a little bit better. And then, of course, I have here potential versus actual. This is a good example of the two functioning together, tautology and teleology. Potential is not unless actualized. There it is. That's my Kolmogorov complexity. I have distilled one encoded piece of information through semantics because you can actually do it mathematically as well. But I'm doing it with language. Potential is not unless actualized. There's a paradox at the heart of that, and there's a teleology and a tautology all wrapped up into one. And how you unpack that is what allows you to start to see, what? The nature of reality truly is something that is relational to itself. It's essentially a translation of the I am that I am. Same thing. I am that I am is a tautology because you are explaining something by its name. I am that I am, you're saying it twice, tautology twice, but it is also having a relationship to itself in a circular fashion. I am that I am. So it goes, it's like recursive. It turns back onto itself. That would be a teleology. I am is the identity and I am again is the purpose. So you're talking about both. There it is. So that is the conceptual toolkit that we need to move forward into the nature of truth as we will observe it through the lens that I believe is the most ecumenical and clean and neutral. So come back towards part 6 to look at the semantics. So, getting a little bit deeper into analytical philosophy because it is worth it. Once we do that, we will have the groundwork needed to actually start entering into truth as it exists in its unitary state and how to understand that. So, I'll see you then.